Ratification and Washington. So, as much as they've made the whole Constitution, the thing is it has to be ratified. Congress knew that they had very much exceeded their instructions by preparing an entirely new government. And they also knew that technically under the Articles of Confederation, they would have had to get unanimous consent, which there's no way that would have happened. I mean, remember, they couldn't even pass a 5% duty on trade. So, knowing this, they're going to add one last article to the Constitution that basically says, okay, this government will go into effect when it's been ratified by at least 9 of the states. At this point, Congress is accepting of it and submits the Constitution to the states in September of 1787. So those who are in favor of ratifying the Constitution are going to dub themselves Federalists. Now, the reason they dub themselves this was really a term meant to deflect charges that they're actually, favoring an excessive centralized political authority. Something like nationalist people would have been like, oh, you just want a really strong centralized government. And keep in mind, that was part of the issue, is they felt like it would be too similar to Great Britain, and there was, just a whole revolution about breaking away from an excessive centralized government. So that's what they wanted to do, is deflect from that. But the Federalists were also really smart about this. They also, by default, gave their opponents the name the Anti-Federalists. First of all, this is really hard for the Anti-Federalists to ever overcome, because it's a negative sounding label that obscures that they really just wanted a state-centered sovereignty more than anything else. And just a negative sounding label is really problematic. I mean, even if you look at like big debates today, for instance, you have like pro-choice and pro-life. Nobody wants to be the anti-choice or the anti-life group. So Anti-Federalists, you can see here, are initially outmaneuvered, and they basically never managed to mount an effective campaign to counter all of the Federalist pamphlets, speeches, newspaper editorials. The Anti-Federalists instead are going to cling to this belief that really only a small republic could actually secure the voluntary attachment of people necessary for this large of a free government. They're going to argue that this large republic, like one that's being framed by the Constitution, will inevitably become tyrannical because it's just too distant. It's too far removed from the common person. But this was no match for the Federalists. The Federalists are going to really manage to mobilize their supporters, and they're going to successfully portray the Constitution as basically the best opportunity to erect a governing structure that was capable of preserving and extending all those gains that had been fought for during the American Revolution. The thing is, a lot of people who are going to be for the Constitution were conservatives, like shaken by Shays' Rebellion, or groups that they knew that their interests would be promoted by the economic development that would come about because of a more centralized government. So this would be like creditors, merchants, manufacturers, urban artisans, commercial farmers. And so they also saw this as having a more centralized federal government could, promote a more stable and uniform currency, and it could raise revenues to pay off Revolutionary War debt, which some of them, might have been owed some of that money. The other thing the Federalists do that's really extremely smart is they basically start making the debate be, you can choose two things. You can choose to have the Articles of Confederation exactly the way they are, which we've already seen has some problems, or you can choose the Constitution. And there was a lot of people that actually wanted something between these 2 points. They were like, well, why can't we just amend the Articles? And they're like, no, we've already tried that, and that's how we got the Constitution. And then there were other people that were going, no, we want to amend the Constitution. And they're like, nope, these are your two options. So which are you going to choose? Well, it turns out when you're only given two options rather than that gray area between, a lot of people were more willing to go for that second option, being the Constitution, because they knew that the Articles on some level was failing. And we're going to see some issues about that amending the Constitution in just a second. So early on, when it comes to ratification, you're going to get states like Delaware, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, and Connecticut. So that's 5. Remember, it goes into effect when 9 ratify it. But besides Pennsylvania, really, these states were small. They were sparsely populated states that they knew that they stood to benefit economically or militarily. It's a lot harder to get the larger states to ratify it. The thing is, a lot of the states and a lot of people were worried about the absence of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. It's really fascinating. Madison actually admitted way after the fact that most likely the biggest problem during the whole Philadelphia Convention was probably the fact that they didn't include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and he would have liked to. A lot of it was just, you might be going, wow, why didn't they? They were so exhausted after having put forward so many compromises after taking months to do this, plus like summer, and they don't necessarily have air conditioning the same way today. And so it's one of those things that they were just tired and they went home and they finished. And if they had had longer, most likely a Bill of Rights would have been included from the very beginning. Anyway, Federalists are basically going to promise that they will recommend amending the Constitution as soon as it's ratified. So you need to ratify it so we can amend it. Now this pushes Massachusetts, Maryland, South Carolina, and New Hampshire all to ratify it. Now if you've been doing your math, you're going, wait a second, that's 9 states. But the thing is, as much as that might be 9 states, they really need the 2 largest states to ratify it, which would be Virginia and New York. To convince these 2 states, you're going to see a group of papers published at this time known as the Federalist Papers. Now, the Federalist Papers are going to turn a lot of traditional Republican doctrine on its head, and they're going to actually say, no, by having a really large and diverse republic, that actually offers the best hope for safeguarding the rights of all the citizens. Because with a large republic, and you have a multitude of contending interest groups, you have so much diversity, that makes it a lot more difficult for any combination of them to really coalesce into a tyrannical majority that then could oppress minority rights. These arguments and these papers are going to bring New York and Virginia into the fray. However, the last 2 states, North Carolina and Rhode Island, they actually only ratify the Constitution after this new government is already functioning. So you can see here exactly when all the different states ratify it. And so you can see how, like, you've got the small states, then you got the second round of states that come in, and then you have, Virginia and New York, and then you get your last 2 of North Carolina and Rhode Island. I just had this in a book and I was like, oh, this is such a great way to put it. Notice how a lot of the states are saying yay, but they're like, oh, but with amendments. And so they're kind of adding that in. So I want you to take a second, and before I talk about Washington, I want you to read this source. Now I'm going to read it out loud, but I would recommend definitely reading it out loud and everything. This is basically an individual who was present for George Washington's inaugural address, and he is describing what happened at it and how Washington was acting. And I want you to look at this source and kind of take a second and think to yourself, how would you characterize Washington? What's important about this source? What kind of sticks out to you from this source? So go ahead and take a second to do that, and then I'm going to go forward. And I'm going to go ahead and push forward, so pause if you need. Obviously, you would need more time to look at this, but there we go. George Washington. George Washington is going to be the first president of the United States starting on April 30th of 1789. When this happened, 2 states hadn't even ratified the Constitution yet. Here's looking at you, Rhode Island and North Carolina. The thing is, On March 4th of 1789, members of Congress were actually scheduled to meet and count the Electoral College, but on that date, only 1/4 of them had even arrived. So Washington, it's a bit embarrassing for him, and so he's going to dally at Mount Vernon until he's formally notified of his election. Now, hopefully you'll notice this a little bit from that source previously, but Washington has every reason to dread the burden of the presidency. First of all, before I get into some of the reasons why, Washington himself, he was a little dramatic. Washington men were not very long-lived, and so he had really fully expected after he went home after the Revolutionary War, he expected to die within the next couple of years, especially when like General Greene, like the youngest general on the American side in the American Revolution, died. And so Washington just kind of assumes he's going to die. And he even like sent letters to Lafayette saying, "Oh, I will never see you again in my lifetime." And he's a little dramatic, like I said. He doesn't die at that point. And so he never really expected to take public office again. But the reason he has to dread the presidency isn't just, oh, he's stepping back into the limelight, which Martha was not happy about, by the way. But this is a new national government. He has to, help establish the legitimacy of this new government. Most Americans feared centralized authority. Really, this means he has to establish loyalty to this new government that the main virtue in the eyes of many were the vagueness of its defined powers. He had also achieved legendary status during the Revolution, so it's questionable, can he really, continue on that way, or will he disappoint the American people? And then there's tons of problems that we've seen previously with, the Articles of Confederation that now, yes, there's a new government, but now these problems need to be fixed, such as like the immense amount of debt that had occurred during the Revolution, the unstable conditions in the West, remember the British presence out West, and then just establishing the new republic's legitimacy. The realities of governing are going to soon shatter the nonpartisan ideal that had actually been present when the Constitution was ratified. And in fact, by the end of Washington's first term, it's very clear that two political parties are forming. One of the parties is going to be the Federalist Party under John Adams. The Federalist Party is going to favor a much more stronger centralized government, whereas the Jeffersonian Republicans, who you can guess who's leading them, Thomas Jefferson, they were much more distrustful of an excessive centralized power. Really, these two parties are going to take shape as a result of like differences over financial policy, as well as what should the American response be to the French Revolution, and we're going to get into this later. Washington, if you had to put him into one of these categories, was more along the lines of a Federalist. Federalists in this way are therefore going to control the federal government until 1800. In 1800, Thomas Jefferson will win the presidency. He's the third president and everything, and that's when the Jeffersonian Republicans will take over.